"Get me the best surgeon in this damn hospital," the Admiral's voice echoed through the chaotic emergency room, cracking with a father's absolute terror. His hands were stained with his daughter's blood. The chief administrator nodded frantically, paging the head of trauma. But when the double doors swung open, the breath left the Admiral's lungs. Standing there, scrubbing in with cold, unforgiving eyes, wasn't just a decorated doctor. It was the disgraced Navy nurse he had personally court-martialed and ruined 12 years ago. Now, his daughter's life was entirely in her hands. Will vengeance or the oath prevail? The rain in Seattle was coming down in sheets, blurring the flashing red and blue lights of the police escort into chaotic smears of neon. Inside the lead SUV, Admiral Richard Sterling sat frozen, his pristine four-star dress uniform soaked in a horrific mixture of rainwater and arterial blood. His daughter Chloe was unconscious beside him, her head cradled in the hands of a desperate paramedic. Just 20 minutes earlier, they had been at a charity gala downtown. A drunk driver, careening at 80 miles an hour in a heavy pickup, had blown through a red light and T-boned the Admiral's town car on the passenger side. The impact had crushed the steel frame inward, trapping 22-year-old Chloe in a mangled cage of glass and metal. "Stay with me, Chloe. Do you hear me?" "That's an order," Sterling whispered, his voice trembling, a rare, terrifying sound for a man who had commanded carrier strike groups in the South China Sea. The SUV violently slammed to a halt at the ambulance bay of Harborview Medical Center. Before it even settled on its suspension, the doors were wrenched open. A swarm of blue-scrubbed trauma staff descended like a synchronized military unit. "Blunt force trauma to the chest and abdomen. Heart rate is spiking to 140. Pressure is tanking at 70/40. She's crashing!" The paramedic shouted over the roar of the storm, pulling the gurney out. Sterling stumbled out after them, the heavy brass on his chest feeling like anchors. He was a man accustomed to absolute control, a man who moved fleets with a signature. But here, sprinting down the sterile, blindingly white corridors of Harborview, he was entirely powerless. The smell of bleach and metallic blood filled his nostrils, replacing the familiar scent of salt and aviation fuel. "Sir, you can't come past these doors." A heavy-set security guard stepped in front of Trauma Bay 1, holding up a hand. "That is my daughter," Sterling roared, the sheer volume and command in his voice making the guard flinch. "I am Admiral Richard Sterling of the United States Navy, and I am not leaving her side." Dr. Harrison Boyle, the hospital's chief administrator, hurried down the hallway, his face pale. He had been alerted the moment the dispatch went out. Harborview was a Level 1 trauma center, used to VIPs, but a 4-star Admiral's daughter dying in their bay was a logistical and PR nightmare. "Admiral Sterling, please," Dr. Boyle said smoothly, stepping between the infuriated military man and the trauma doors. "My staff is doing everything they can to stabilize her, but her injuries are catastrophic. She has a massive internal bleed. We need to open her up immediately, or she won't make it." "Then do it!" Sterling grabbed Boyle by the lapels of his white coat, lifting the smaller man onto his toes. "I don't want your residents. I don't want your second-string attendings. Get me the best surgeon in this damn hospital. Get me the head of trauma, now." "She's already on her way down from the helipad," Boyle choked out, gently prying the Admiral's fingers from his coat. "She is the best on the West Coast, Admiral. I promise you. If anyone can put your daughter back together, it's Dr. Jenkins." Sterling released the administrator, his chest heaving as he paced the waiting area like a caged tiger. He glanced through the small, reinforced glass window of the trauma doors. He could see the frenzy inside. Nurses hanging bags of O-negative blood, respiratory therapists securing an airway. He watched the heart monitor above Chloe's bed. The jagged green line was erratic, stumbling, failing. Jenkins. The name barely registered in his frantic mind. It was a common enough name. Right now, all he cared about was that this doctor had the hands of God. The heavy double doors at the end of the corridor banged open. A woman strode through, moving with a fast, predatory grace. She was pulling a sterile blue surgical cap over her dark hair, her face set in a mask of absolute, terrifying calm. 2 surgical residents jogged to keep up with her, reading off a tablet. Get the rapid infuser running, prep an open chest tray, and call the blood bank. Tell them I need a massive transfusion protocol activated 5 minutes ago, she snapped, her voice carrying a sharp, commanding timbre that sliced through the noise of the ER. Admiral Sterling turned towards the voice. He stepped forward to intercept her, to demand reassurance, to assert his presence as a commanding officer and a father. "Doctor, I am Admiral." The woman stopped dead in her tracks. She looked up from the tablet, her steely grey eyes locking onto his. Sterling's words died in his throat. The world around him seemed to lose its sound. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors, the shouts of the nurses, the drumming of the rain outside. It all vanished, sucked into a vacuum of sudden, paralyzing recognition. It had been 12 years. The woman was older now, her face lined with the stress of 1,000 surgeries, her posture radiating an elite, untouchable authority. But Sterling knew those eyes. He knew that defiant tilt of the chin. She wasn't just a surgeon. "Sarah," Sterling whispered, the name tasting like ash on his tongue. Dr. Sarah Jenkins stared at the 4-star Admiral. She looked at his blood-soaked uniform, then at the frantic trauma bay behind him. A muscle feathered in her jaw. 12 years ago, this man had stripped her of her uniform. He had stood in a tribunal room, called her a dangerous liability, and destroyed her military career because she dared to defy his rigid protocols. "Admiral Sterling," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a low, icy whisper. She didn't flinch. She didn't back down. She just looked at him with the cold detachment of a woman who had buried her past and built an empire on its ashes. "It's my daughter in there," Sterling managed to say, his voice cracking, the arrogance entirely gone. "Chloe." Sarah's eyes flicked to the trauma bay window. She saw the young woman on the table, her chest bruised black and purple, the life draining out of her. Then she looked back at the man who had ruined her life. "Step aside, Admiral," Sarah said, her tone devoid of any emotion. "Unless you want to kill someone else today." Before Sterling could react, she pushed past him, kicking open the doors to the trauma bay and disappearing into the chaos, leaving the most powerful man in the Pacific Fleet standing paralyzed in the hallway, haunted by the ghosts of the USS Eisenhower, 12 years earlier. Persian Gulf. The heat was suffocating, a thick, oppressive blanket of humidity that smelled intensely of aviation fuel, salt, and fear. On the flight deck of the USS Eisenhower, operations were running at a frenetic, deafening pace. FA-18 Super Hornets were launching and recovering, slamming onto the steel deck with bone-rattling force. Below deck, in the ship's primary medical bay, 26-year-old Lieutenant Sarah Jenkins wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead. She was a Navy Nurse Corps officer, a trauma specialist who had spent the last 2 years patching up sailors who got careless around heavy machinery. She loved the Navy. She loved the rigid structure, the camaraderie, the knowledge that her skills were the last line of defense for the young men and women aboard. She was currently changing the dressing on a seaman's scalded arm when the ship shuddered. It wasn't the normal shudder of a jet catching the arresting wire. It was a violent, teeth-rattling concussion that threw Sarah off her feet. The lights flickered, died, and then the emergency red strobes kicked on, bathing the medical bay in a hellish crimson glow. Then came the alarm. "Fire on the flight deck! Fire on the flight deck! This is not a drill! All damage control parties report to the aft catapult!" A heavily armed FA-18 had suffered a catastrophic landing gear failure. The jet had skidded, sparking a massive blaze that ignited its payload and fuel reserves. Within seconds, the aft section of the carrier was a blazing inferno. Less than 3 minutes later, the first casualties began pouring down the narrow metal ladders. "Incoming!" someone screamed. The doors to the medical bay blew open, and chaos flooded in. Sailors were carrying their crewmates over their shoulders, their uniforms blackened with soot, skin blistered and raw. The screams were deafening, a chorus of agony that drowned out the klaxons. "Get them on the cots! Triage protocols in effect!" shouted Commander Thomas Miller, the ship's chief medical officer. "Jenkins, you're with me. Red tags only." Sarah moved purely on instinct and adrenaline. She grabbed a trauma kit and hit the floor, sliding in blood and water as she moved from one agonizing scene to the next. She packed wounds, pushed morphine, and applied tourniquets, her hands moving with a desperate mechanical precision. The small medical team was vastly outnumbered. They had 2 surgeons, 3 nurses, and a handful of corpsmen. There were at least 40 casualties. In the corner of the bay, a corpsman was frantically doing chest compressions on a young sailor whose flight deck jersey had melted into his skin. Sarah recognized him, Petty Officer 3rd Class Thomas Wright. He was 19, a farm kid from Iowa, who had shown her pictures of his golden retriever just 2 days ago. "He's not breathing," the corpsman yelled, his eyes wide with panic. "Pulse is thready. He took shrapnel to the chest." Sarah abandoned the burn victim she was stabilizing and rushed over. She ripped away what was left of Wright's shirt. There was a jagged piece of dark, twisted metal lodged deep in the right side of his chest. His neck veins were bulging violently, and his face was turning a horrifying shade of blue. "Tracheal deviation," Sarah muttered, pressing her fingers against his neck. She grabbed her stethoscope, pressing it to his chest. Nothing. No breath sounds. He's got a tension pneumothorax. His lung has collapsed, and the pressure is crushing his heart. Where is Commander Miller? She spun around. Commander Miller was at the other end of the bay, elbow deep in the open abdomen of a pilot, fighting a massive hemorrhage. The other surgeon, Dr. Evans, had been knocked unconscious by a falling bulkhead during the initial blast. "Miller!" Sarah screamed over the din. "I need you here! Tension pneumo! Progressing to cardiac tamponade! I need to decompress him!" Miller didn't even look up. "I can't leave this guy, Jenkins, or he bleeds out. Needle decompress him and wait." Sarah grabbed a 14-gauge needle and plunged it into Wright's second intercostal space. There was a sharp hiss of escaping air, but Wright's color didn't improve. The monitor hooked up to him began to scream a flat, sustained tone. He was coding. The shrapnel nicked his pericardium, Sarah realized, a cold dread washing over her. Blood was filling the sac around the boy's heart. The needle wouldn't fix this. He needed a clamshell thoracotomy. He needed his chest cracked open, the blood evacuated, and the bleeder clamped. "Right now. Commander!" Sarah yelled again. "He needs a thoracotomy. He's dying. I am in the middle of an aorta, Jenkins," Miller roared back. "You are a nurse. You maintain his airway and you wait. Do not touch a scalpel. That is an order." Sarah looked down at Petty Officer Wright. He was 19. He had a golden retriever named Buster. If she waited for Miller, Wright would be dead in 60 seconds. The military was built on rules. It was built on a chain of command. You did not disobey a direct order from a commanding officer. If you did, you faced a court-martial, dishonorable discharge, and potentially prison. A nurse did not cut open a patient's chest. Sarah looked at the scalpel sitting on the sterile tray next to the cot. She looked at the boy's blue face. Screw the rules, she thought. "Give me a number 10 blade and a rib spreader," Sarah ordered the terrified corpsman beside her. "Ma'am," the commander said, "I don't care what he said. Give me the damn blade before this boy dies," she snapped. With shaking hands, the corpsman handed her the scalpel. Sarah didn't hesitate. She made a massive, sweeping incision across the young sailor's chest, cutting through muscle and tissue. Blood welled up instantly. She grabbed the heavy metal rib spreaders, inserted them into the incision, and cranked them open with a sickening crack. The boy's chest cavity was exposed. His heart was barely quivering, trapped inside a bulging, blood-filled sac. Just as Sarah reached in with a pair of surgical scissors to snip the pericardium, the heavy steel doors of the medical bay flew open again. Admiral Richard Sterling strode into the room, flanked by his security detail. He had come down from the bridge to inspect the damage and assess the casualty count. His uniform was immaculate, a stark contrast to the blood-soaked nightmare around him. He surveyed the room, his eyes scanning the chaos, until they landed on the corner. He saw a nurse, identifiable by her rank insignia, standing over a sailor with his chest cracked completely wide open, her hands deep inside his body cavity. "What in God's name is going on here?" Admiral Sterling's voice boomed, cutting through the noise like a thunderclap. He marched over to Sarah's station, his face a mask of absolute outrage. "Commander Miller, why is a nurse performing battlefield surgery on my ship?" Sarah didn't look up. She snipped the sack. Dark blood poured out, and instantly Wright's heart gave a violent, beautiful shudder and began to beat again. "Admiral, step back," Sarah said through gritted teeth, plunging her fingers into the cavity to find the bleeding vessel. "This is a sterile field." "You are a lieutenant and a nurse," Sterling shouted, stepping closer, his face turning red. "You are operating outside your medical license and violating direct naval protocol. Step away from that man immediately and surrender your hands." "If I step away, he dies," Sarah yelled back, finally finding the nicked artery and clamping it down. "I saved his life." "You disobeyed a direct order in a combat zone," Sterling bellowed. "Master-at-Arms, remove Lieutenant Jenkins from this bay immediately. She is under arrest." Two armed sailors stepped forward, grabbing Sarah's arms and physically ripping her away from the sterile field. "No, he needs to be closed. I clamped the bleeder." Sarah screamed, fighting against the heavy hands of the guards. She looked at Commander Miller, who was staring at her in shock. "Miller, close him up! Close him up!" Admiral Sterling stood tall, looking down at Sarah with a gaze of pure, uncompromising disgust. To him, the military survived on discipline. A rogue element, even one with good intentions, was a cancer that would destroy the entire ship. "You're done in the Navy, Lieutenant," Sterling said coldly. "You will face a court-martial, and I will personally see to it that you never touch a patient in uniform again." As she was dragged out of the bloody bay, forced to leave her patient behind, the injustice of it burned into her soul. She had done the impossible. She had saved a life when the system failed, and for that, they were going to destroy her. The heavy doors of Trauma Bay 1 swung shut, slicing off Admiral Richard Sterling's view of the chaos inside. For the first time in his 62 years of life, the decorated commander felt his knees buckle. He leaned heavily against the cold, sterile wall of the corridor, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing above him like a swarm of angry hornets. He had sent thousands of men into combat, had watched missiles streak across black oceans, and had written condolence letters to grieving mothers. But he had never been the one waiting outside the door. Inside the bay, Dr. Sarah Jenkins didn't spare a single second to process the monumental irony of the situation. Her mind compartmentalized the trauma of her past with the ruthless efficiency of a steel trap snapping shut. Right now, the girl on the table wasn't the daughter of the man who had destroyed her life. She was a puzzle of torn tissue, failing organs, and catastrophic hemorrhage. "Talk to me, Clara," Sarah barked, snapping a pair of sterile gloves over her hands. Nurse Clara Higgins, a veteran ER nurse who had worked alongside Sarah for 5 years, didn't miss a beat. "Chloe Sterling, 22, unrestrained passenger in a high-speed lateral collision. GCS is a 4. Blood pressure is 60 over palpable. Heart rate 145 and thready. She's received 2 units of O negative, but she's bleeding out faster than we can push it. Fast exam shows massive free fluid in the abdomen. She has a crushed pelvis." Sarah stepped up to the table. Chloe's skin was the color of skim milk, her lips tinged with a terrifying ashen blue. Her chest rose and fell in ragged, uneven gasps around the endotracheal tube the paramedics had placed. "She's in class 4 hemorrhagic shock," Sarah said, her voice a flat, commanding baritone that instantly centered the frantic room. "If we transport her to the OR right now, she'll code in the elevator. We need to stop the pelvic bleeding here, or she's dead in 3 minutes." "Do you want a pelvic binder?" a junior resident asked, his hands shaking as he held a pair of trauma shears. "A binder won't be enough. The venous plexus is likely shredded, and I suspect arterial involvement," Sarah replied, her eyes scanning the monitors. "We need to temporarily clamp off her lower circulation. I'm doing a reboa." The room went dead silent for a fraction of a second. Resuscitative endovascular balloon occlusion of the aorta, reboa, was a highly advanced, incredibly risky procedure. It involved snaking a balloon catheter up through the femoral artery in the groin and inflating it directly inside the aorta to cut off blood supply to the lower body, essentially clamping on the biggest blood vessel in the body from the inside. "Dr. Jenkins, she's barely hanging on. If you miss the zone, you'll rupture her aorta," Dr. Robert Gable, the attending anesthesiologist, warned from the head of the bed, his hands working furiously over a cocktail of vasopressors. "I won't miss," Sarah said coldly. "Clara, get the reboa kit. Ultrasound to the right groin, now." Out in the hallway, Admiral Sterling pressed his face against the small pane of reinforced glass in the doors. He couldn't hear the words, but he could read the frantic, hyper-focused body language of the trauma team. He watched Sarah move. She didn't hesitate. She didn't seek permission. She moved with an absolute, terrifying authority, the exact same authority she had displayed on the blood-soaked deck of the USS Eisenhower 12 years ago. "You are a nurse," Sterling's own voice echoed in his memory, a ghost rising from the deep. "You are operating outside your medical license. Step away from that man immediately." Sterling squeezed his eyes shut. He had been so rigid, so deeply entrenched in the absolute doctrine of the chain of command, that he had viewed her life-saving initiative as a dangerous mutiny. He had broken her for it, and now she was the only thing standing between his daughter and a body bag. "I'm in the common femoral artery," Sarah announced inside the bay, her eyes glued to the ultrasound screen as she fed the guide wire into Chloe's groin, measuring the catheter, targeting zone 1, right above the celiac axis, feeding the balloon. Her hands, long and elegant, moved with microscopic precision. The atmosphere in the room was suffocatingly tense. One wrong millimeter, one fraction of an inch too high or too low, and the balloon would shred Chloe's internal organs or blow out her heart. "Balloon is in position," Sarah said. A bead of sweat dripped from her forehead beneath her surgical cap. "Inflating now. 10 cc's of saline." She pushed the plunger on the syringe. "Look at the pressure," Clara gasped. On the monitor overhead, the terrible, sluggish red numbers of Chloe's blood pressure suddenly spiked. 60/40ths, 85/50ths, 110/70ths. By inflating the balloon, Sarah had effectively clamped off the massive bleeding in Chloe's pelvis, redirecting all remaining blood flow to her brain and heart. It bought them time, but it was a ticking clock. The lower half of Chloe's body was now dying from a lack of oxygen. "We have a maximum of 45 minutes before she loses her legs or suffers irreversible ischemic damage to her kidneys," Sarah stated, pulling her bloodied gloves off and tossing them into a biohazard bin. "Let's move her to OR4. Clara, call the blood bank and tell them to send up the cooler. Gable, keep her paralyzed and sedated. I'm going to go scrub." As the team unlocked the wheels of the gurney and began sprinting out of the trauma bay, the doors burst open, nearly knocking Admiral Sterling backward. Sterling reached out, his hand grasping the metal rail of his daughter's bed for a fleeting second. "Chloe." Sarah stepped directly into his path, her slight frame suddenly imposing, cutting off his access. "Admiral, keep your hands off my gurney." Sterling looked at her, his jaw trembling. The 4 stars on his collar felt like lead weights. She is actively bleeding to death from a crushed pelvis and severe abdominal trauma," Sarah said, her voice devoid of any bedside manner. "It was a tactical briefing, nothing more. I have temporarily stabilized her pressure, but I have to open her up to find the source. If I can't repair the vessels in the next 40 minutes, she will die on my table. Do you understand?" "Save her," Sterling whispered, a single, agonizing tear finally breaking loose, and tracing a path down his weathered cheek. The great Admiral was begging, "Please, Sarah, name your price. Whatever you want. Just save my little girl." Sarah stared at him. 12 years of resentment, of lost pensions, of public humiliation, and of starting over from the absolute bottom roared in her chest. She looked at the broken man before her. "My name is Dr. Jenkins," she replied softly, her grey eyes like chips of flint. "And I don't do this for you. I do this because I took an oath. Something the Navy apparently forgot." She turned on her heel and jogged after the surgical team, leaving Sterling completely alone in the cold, echoing hallway. 12 years earlier, Naval Station Norfolk. The courtroom was panelled in dark, imposing mahogany. The air was thick with the scent of brass polish and the silent, heavy judgment of military tradition. Lieutenant Sarah Jenkins sat rigidly at the defence table, her dress white uniform pristine, though it felt like a straitjacket. At the front of the room, sitting at the centre of the tribunal panel, was Admiral Richard Sterling. His expression was carved from granite. "Lieutenant Jenkins," Admiral Sterling's voice echoed through the microphone, devoid of any warmth or doubt. "The facts of this case are not in dispute. You, a commissioned Nurse Corps officer, bypassed your commanding medical officer, ignored a direct order to stand down, and performed a highly invasive clamshell thoracotomy on Petty Officer 3rd Class Thomas Wright, a surgical procedure you are neither licensed nor authorized to perform. Admiral, with all due respect," Sarah's defense counsel, a nervous JAG lawyer, stood up. "Lieutenant Jenkins' actions, while technically outside protocol, directly saved Petty Officer Wright's life. Commander Miller was engaged in another critical surgery, and the patient was seconds away from cardiac arrest due to a tension pneumothorax." "Protocol is not a suggestion, Counselor." Sterling slammed his palm on the desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "The United States Navy operates on discipline and the chain of command. If every nurse, corpsman, and seaman decides to play God and rewrite the rules of engagement because they feel they know better, this military will collapse into anarchy. We are not cowboys. We are sailors." Sterling fixed his gaze directly on Sarah. She didn't look away. She sat with her spine straight, her chin held high, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. "You are a liability, Lieutenant," Sterling said, his words measured and lethal. "Your arrogant disregard for authority makes you a danger to your unit and to this Navy. The board finds you guilty of insubordination and conduct unbecoming an officer." The gavel fell. "You are hereby stripped of your rank, discharged dishonorably from the United States Navy, and forfeit all military benefits and pensions. You are dismissed." In that single, echoing strike of wood against wood, Sarah's life was obliterated. Her identity, her career, her financial security, gone. She had walked out of those gates with nothing but a duffel bag and a permanent black mark on her record. No civilian hospital would touch a nurse with a dishonorable discharge for rogue surgical behavior. She had spent the next 4 years working night shifts as an EMT, taking out crushing student loans and clawing her way through medical school in her late 20s. She didn't just become a doctor. She became a machine. She outstudied, outworked, and outperformed every single resident in her cohort. She specialized in trauma because trauma didn't care about politics or protocol. Trauma only cared about who had the fastest hands and the coldest nerve. Present day, Harborview Medical Center, Operating Room 4. The harsh glare of the surgical overhead lights snapped Sarah back to the present. The rhythmic, mechanical hiss of the ventilator filled the room as Dr. Gable monitored Chloe's vitals. "We're ready, Dr. Jenkins," Nurse Clara said, handing Sarah a #10 scalpel. "Time of incision, 23:14, Sarah announced. She pressed the blade to Chloe's abdomen, making a swift, vertical midline incision from the sternum down to the pubis. The moment she cut through the fascia and the peritoneum, a geyser of dark, pooling blood spilled out onto the sterile drapes. The smell of copper filled the room instantly. Suction! Get 2 Yankauers in there. I can't see a damn thing, Sarah ordered, her hands plunging directly into the pool of blood. She needed to find the source. She packed laparotomy sponges deep into all 4 quadrants of Chloe's abdomen, a technique designed to absorb the blood and temporarily halt the bleeding by applying pressure. Her spleen is pulverized, Sarah noted, pulling out a handful of ruined, dark purple tissue. Clara, clamp. We're doing a rapid splenectomy. It's too damaged to salvage. She worked with blinding speed, clamping the splenic artery and vein, cutting the ligaments, and removing the ruined organ in less than 2 minutes. But the bleeding didn't stop. The blood welling up in the lower abdomen was torrential. Pressure is dropping again, Dr. Gable warned, his voice tight. 70/40. The Reboa balloon is holding the aortic pressure, but she's losing volume fast below the clamp. Sarah pulled the sponges from the right lower quadrant, carefully examining the retroperitoneal space. Her stomach dropped. It's not just the venous plexus, Sarah whispered, her eyes narrowing behind her loops. The sheer force of the collision snapped her pelvic ring, and a jagged piece of the iliac bone has sliced right through her inferior vena cava. A collective intake of breath echoed around the OR. The inferior vena cava, IVC, is the largest vein in the body, carrying deoxygenated blood from the lower half of the body back to the heart. A tear in the IVC was a massive, often fatal injury. It was notoriously difficult to repair because the vein was fragile, thin-walled, and constantly flooding the surgical field with blood. I need vascular clamps, large DeBakey forceps, and 4-0-proline on a cardiovascular needle, Sarah commanded, her voice betraying none of the adrenaline spiking in her bloodstream. Gable, give her 2 more units of packed red blood cells and fresh frozen plasma. If I don't sew this shut in the next 10 minutes, we hit the irreversible shock triad. Dr. Jenkins, Clara said softly, handing her the delicate needle driver. It's a massive tear. The tissue is friable. I know, Sarah said. She leaned in, the rest of the world falling away. This was the red line. This was the exact place where medicine ceased to be science and became an art form dictated by nerve. She had to mobilize the massive vein, clamp it above and below the tear to stop the bleeding, and stitch the fragile tissue back together without narrowing the vessel so much that it caused a massive blood clot later. Her hands, once deemed a liability by the man pacing the halls outside, were entirely steady. She placed the first clamp. The vein slipped, slick with blood. She adjusted, gritting her teeth, and clamped it again. Got it. First stitch, she muttered, driving the curved needle through the delicate, paper-thin tissue of the vein. Suddenly the doors to the OR observation deck opened above them. Dr. Harrison Boyle, the chief administrator, stepped up to the glass microphone. Dr. Jenkins, Admiral Sterling is threatening to call the Secretary of the Navy to have military surgeons flown in if we don't give him a status update right now. Boyle's voice crackled nervously over the intercom. Sarah didn't look up. Her hands continued to move, weaving the delicate blue thread through the torn vein in a continuous, flawless rhythm. Tell the Admiral, Sarah said, her voice echoing coldly over the OR speakers, that if he distracts me for 1 more second while I hold his daughter's life in my hands, he won't need a military surgeon. He'll need a mortician. Turn the intercom off, Dr. Boyle. The intercom clicked off with a sharp, static pop. Sarah tied the final knot, cinching the delicate repair tight. Releasing the vascular clamps. Let's see if it holds. She slowly loosened the heavy metal clamps. The team held their breath, watching the repaired vein. The blood rushed through it, swelling the vessel. There was no leak. The suture line held perfectly. Bleeding is controlled, Sarah exhaled, a profound wave of exhaustion suddenly washing over her. Gable, I'm deflating the Reboa balloon now. Get ready to manage the reperfusion cascade. As Sarah slowly deflated the balloon, restoring blood flow to Chloe's lower half, the numbers on the monitor stabilized. The jagged, terrifying line of her heart rate settled into a strong, rhythmic beat. Sarah stepped back from the table, her sterile gown painted in dark crimson. She looked at the young woman on the table. She had done it. Against all odds, she had pulled Chloe Sterling back from the edge of the abyss. "Clara, finish washing out her abdomen and prep her for temporary closure," Sarah said, stripping her bloody gown off. "We'll need to come back in 48 hours to reconstruct her pelvis, but she's going to live." As Sarah walked out of the operating room, pushing through the heavy swing doors to the scrub sinks, she knew the hardest part wasn't over. The surgery was done. But now, she had to face the man who had ordered her professional execution 12 years ago, and tell him that the liability had just saved his world. The surgical waiting room on the 4th floor of Harborview Medical Center was a desolate place at 3 in the morning. The harsh fluorescent lights hummed a low, irritating frequency, casting long shadows across the rows of vinyl chairs. Admiral Richard Sterling sat completely motionless in the corner, his pristine uniform now a stiff, drying mosaic of rust-colored stains. For the past 3 hours, his mind had been a war zone. He was a man who had navigated the geopolitical minefields of the South China Sea, commanding the Pacific Fleet with an iron fist. He had briefed presidents at the Pentagon and had overseen joint operations at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. Yet, none of that power could buy him a single ounce of leverage in this room. He stared at his hands. They were trembling. The heavy oak door to the waiting room clicked open, breaking the suffocating silence. Dr. Sarah Jenkins walked in. She had removed her surgical cap and gown, but she was still wearing her blue scrubs, the fabric damp with sweat around the collar. Her face was pale, drawn tight with the absolute exhaustion that only a 4-hour, life-or-death trauma surgery could induce. She held a stainless steel clipboard in her left hand. Sterling stood up immediately, his knees popping in the quiet room. He braced himself, his military posture failing to hide the absolute terror in his eyes. "Sarah," he began, his voice raspy. "Dr. Jenkins," Sarah corrected him, her voice a low, flat line of pure professionalism. "Sit down, Admiral. You look like you're about to go into cardiogenic shock yourself." Sterling didn't sit. "My daughter. Just tell me." Sarah looked down at the chart, her expression unreadable. "She is alive." The breath that escaped Sterling's lungs sounded like a collapsing sail. He reached out to steady himself against the back of a plastic chair, closing his eyes as a wave of profound, agonizing relief washed over him. "I managed to repair the tear in her inferior vena cava, and we performed an emergency splenectomy to stop the abdominal hemorrhage," Sarah continued, her tone clinical and detached, delivering a situation report rather than offering comfort. "Her vital signs are currently stable, but she is entirely dependent on the ventilator. I've transferred her to the surgical intensive care unit for close monitoring." "Can I see her?" Sterling asked, opening his eyes. The commanding aura of the 4-star Admiral was entirely gone, replaced by the desperate pleading of a broken father. "No," Sarah replied bluntly. "She is in a medically induced coma. Her body has sustained massive trauma, and her core temperature dropped dangerously low during the massive transfusion protocol. We need to keep her in a state of suspended animation to protect her brain function and prevent further metabolic acidosis." Sterling nodded slowly, absorbing the tactical data. "But she will pull through. You saved her." Sarah stepped closer, the physical distance between them evaporating, replaced by the immense, invisible weight of their shared history. She looked at the polished brass stars on his collar, then up into his weathered face. "I stopped the bleeding, Admiral," Sarah said, her grey eyes narrowing slightly. "But something isn't right, and I need you to tell me the truth." Sterling frowned, a flicker of his old defensiveness returning. "What are you talking about?" "During the operation, Chloe's blood wasn't clotting at a normal rate," Sarah said, flipping a page on her clipboard. "Even after we pushed 10 units of packed red blood cells, 6 units of fresh frozen plasma, and multiple rounds of platelets, her surgical field was still weeping blood. Her PT and PTT coagulation times are astronomically high. I ran her military medical ID through the Department of Defense database while I was scrubbing out. It says she has a perfectly clean bill of health. No prior surgeries, no chronic illnesses. She is perfectly healthy, Sterling stated firmly. She is an athlete. She just passed her physical for officer candidate school in Newport last month. Don't lie to me. Sarah's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper, laced with absolute venom. Not in my hospital. Not when I have my hands inside your daughter's chest. Sterling stiffened. What's your tone, Doctor? To hell with my tone, Admiral, Sarah snapped, slamming the heavy steel clipboard down onto the small coffee table. The loud crack made Sterling flinch. I am not your subordinate anymore. You stripped me of that right 12 years ago. I am the only person on this earth keeping your daughter from bleeding out into her own lungs right now. So I will ask you one more time. What underlying medical condition does Chloe have? Sterling looked away, staring at the rain lashing against the waiting room window. His jaw worked furiously, a muscle ticking beneath his ear. Admiral? Sarah warned, her voice dropping to a low, lethal cadence. If you do not tell me what I am dealing with, she will undergo disseminated intravascular coagulation in the next 2 hours, and she will bleed to death through her pores. Tell me. Sterling closed his eyes. The great, unyielding pillar of naval law finally cracked. Von Willebrand disease, he whispered, the words sounding like a confession to a priest. Type 3. Severe. Sarah froze. The anger in her chest was instantly replaced by a cold, clinical horror. Von Willebrand disease type 3 was the most severe form of the bleeding disorder, meaning Chloe's blood completely lacked the essential protein required to make platelets stick together and form a clot. For a trauma patient with massive internal injuries, it was effectively a death sentence if not immediately treated with highly specialized, concentrated clotting factors. Type 3, Sarah breathed, stepping back. That is an automatic, permanent medical disqualification from any branch of the United States Armed Forces. It's a miracle she survived childhood minor injuries. How in God's name did she pass the MEPS physical for officer candidate school? Sterling looked at the floor. I had it expunged. The silence in the room was absolute. It stretched out, heavy and suffocating, as Sarah processed what the man before her had just admitted. You had it expunged, Sarah repeated, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with a sudden, uncontrollable rage. You used your security clearance. You altered federal medical records. You committed a felony, Admiral. She wanted to be a pilot. Sterling suddenly shouted, his voice cracking with desperation, defending his actions to the woman he had court-martialed for far less. Her mother died when she was 10. The Navy is all she has ever known. She has dreamed of sitting in the cockpit of a Hornet since she was a little girl. I wasn't going to let a genetic lottery ruin her life. So you broke the rules, Sarah said, her voice eerily calm, though her eyes burned with the heat of a supernova. Sterling stopped, the realization of his own words suddenly hitting him like a physical blow. You broke the rules, Sarah repeated, stepping into his personal space, pointing a furious, trembling finger at his chest. 12 years ago, I broke protocol to save a 19-year-old boy's life on the deck of your ship. I bypassed a commander who was letting a sailor die. And you destroyed me for it. You stood in that tribunal room and told me that the Navy operates on discipline, that a rogue element destroys the system. You took my career, my pension, and my honor. Sterling opened his mouth to speak, but the words withered in his throat. The towering hypocrisy of his entire existence was laid bare under the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital. I broke a rule to save a life, Sarah hissed, her face inches from his. You broke federal law, compromised military integrity, and put your own daughter's life in catastrophic danger, just to get her a shiny piece of brass on her collar. You aren't a commander, Richard. You're a fraud. Before Sterling could muster a defense, the heavy pager clipped to Sarah's scrub waistband began to emit a shrill, piercing alarm. Sarah looked down. The digital display flashed in bright red letters. Code blue, SICU bed 4, massive hemorrhage. Chloe. Sarah didn't say another word. She bolted for the door, her medical instincts overriding her fury in a fraction of a second. She hit the stairwell at a dead sprint, taking the steps 2 at a time down to the 3rd-floor surgical intensive care unit. Admiral Sterling was right behind her, his heavy dress shoes pounding against the concrete stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. They burst through the double doors of the SICU. The scene inside Chloe's glass-walled room was a nightmare. The monitors above her bed were screaming a chaotic symphony of alarms. Her heart rate was spiking to 160, and her blood pressure was plummeting into the fatal 50s. "Talk to me, David!" Sarah shouted, sliding into the room and grabbing a pair of gloves from the wall dispenser. David, the lead critical care nurse, was frantically hanging new bags of saline while applying hard manual pressure to the surgical dressing on Chloe's abdomen. "She started crashing 2 minutes ago. Her chest tube is dumping bright red blood, over 600 cc's in the last 5 minutes. Her abdominal drains are filling up just as fast. She's bleeding from everywhere." Sarah looked at the surgical site. The thick white bandages were soaked through, a dark, spreading stain of crimson. Because of the hidden type 3 von Willebrand disease, the massive transfusions of regular plasma they had given her in the OR were useless. They didn't contain enough of the specific von Willebrand factor, VWF, and factor VIII complex needed to stop the microscopic bleeding at the surgical sites. Her body was literally unzipping its own repairs. "The standard plasma isn't working. Her body is chewing through the clotting factors faster than we can push them," Sarah stated, her mind racing through complex pharmacological algorithms. "She needs humate P or alphanate immediately. David, call the blood bank. I need a massive dose of VWFF factor 8 concentrate stat." David grabbed the wall phone, his fingers flying across the keypad. He spoke rapidly into the receiver, his face falling a second later. "Dr. Jenkins," David yelled over the alarms. "The blood bank says they don't have enough. We used our emergency stock of Humate P yesterday on a massive trauma pileup on I-5. They only have 1 vial left. It's not enough to synthesize a clot for a patient with this much tissue damage." Sarah felt a cold chill run down her spine. Without the concentrate, Chloe would bleed to death in less than 10 minutes. The repairs Sarah had made to the inferior vena cava would hold structurally, but the tissue itself would ooze until Chloe's vascular system was completely empty. "What about cryoprecipitate?" Sarah demanded. Cryoprecipitate was a blood product rich in fibrinogen and factor VIII, often used as a desperate backup. "They are thawing 10 units now, but it takes 20 minutes, David replied. "She doesn't have 20 minutes. "Ok," Sarah yelled, grabbing a syringe of epinephrine and injecting it directly into Chloe's central line to artificially force her heart to keep pumping. Outside the glass wall, Admiral Sterling stood frozen, watching the monitors flash red. He understood military tactics. He understood logistical failures. But this was a failure of his own making. His lie, his desperate need to protect his daughter's military file, had robbed the hospital of the critical information they needed to prepare the right blood products. He had killed her. "Is there anything else?" David asked, his hands covered in Chloe's blood as he pressed down on her abdomen. "Recombinant factor VIA. It won't work without the von Willebrand factor to anchor it," Sarah muttered, her eyes darting around the room, searching for a miracle in the sterile environment. Then she stopped, her eyes locked onto Admiral Sterling through the glass. An absolutely insane, desperate medical theory formed in her head. It was completely against protocol. It was highly dangerous. It was the kind of rogue medical maneuver that got doctors stripped of their medical licenses. Sarah marched out of the ICU room and grabbed Sterling by the lapels of his uniform, dragging him away from the glass. "You!" Sarah ordered, her eyes burning with an intense, terrifying focus. "Are you a blood match for her?" Sterling blinked, stunned by the sudden physical contact. "What? Yes, I am. I'm O negative. Just like her mother. I'm the universal donor." "I don't care about your blood type, Richard. I care about your genetics," Sarah snapped. Von Willebrand disease is hereditary. If Chloe has type 3, it means she inherited a mutated gene from both parents. Her mother carried it. Do you carry the trait? Sterling nodded rapidly. Yes, I have type 1. It's a mild variant. I have lower levels of the factor, but I clot normally. The military doctors said it wasn't severe enough to disqualify me when I enlisted 40 years ago. Sarah's mind clicked into gear. It's not ideal, but it's all we have. Your blood has the von Willebrand factor, that hers is completely missing. If we do a direct, whole blood transfusion from you to her, bypassing the blood bank, bypassing the filtration protocols, straight from your vein into her central line, we can artificially spike her VWF levels just enough to hold her over until the cryoprecipitate thaws. Do it, Sterling said without a microsecond of hesitation. He began unbuttoning his heavily decorated uniform jacket, ripping it off his shoulders and tossing it onto the hospital floor. He rolled up the sleeve of his white undershirt, baring his arm. Take whatever you need. Drain me dry if you have to. David! Sarah yelled, turning back into the room. Get me a rapid transfusion kit, 2 large-bore 14-gauge needles, and a pressure bag. We are doing a direct, uncross-matched whole blood transfer from the Admiral to the patient. David froze, staring at her in shock. Dr. Jenkins. That is a massive violation of FDA and hospital protocols. A direct person-to-person transfusion hasn't been standard practice since the Vietnam War. If Dr. Boyle finds out, he'll fire you on the spot. I don't care about Dr. Boyle, and I don't care about the protocol, Sarah roared, the ghost of the young Navy lieutenant suddenly flaring to life in the trauma room. She was back on the deck of the Eisenhower. The rules were failing. A life was slipping away. She was not going to let protocol kill another patient. Get me the damn needles, David, Sarah ordered, her voice vibrating with an absolute, unshakable authority. Or I will find a nurse who will. David swallowed hard, nodded, and sprinted to the supply cart. Sarah grabbed an alcohol swab and a tourniquet, moving towards the Admiral. 12 years ago, this man had thrown her to the wolves for breaking the rules. Now, she was going to break the highest medical protocols in civilian healthcare, risking her entirely rebuilt life, to save the one thing he loved. Sit down, Admiral, Sarah said, tying the rubber tourniquet tightly around his bicep. This is going to hurt. The 14-gauge needle was brutal, but Admiral Richard Sterling didn't flinch as Dr. Sarah Jenkins drove it into his arm. Open the stopcock, Sarah ordered David, bypassing every modern filtration protocol to run a direct gravity-assisted line from the Admiral to Chloe's central catheter. Dark venous blood rushed from Sterling's arm directly into his daughter's failing system. The silence in the ICU was absolute, broken only by the frantic beep of the heart monitor. Sterling watched his life force flow into Chloe. The man who commanded fleets was profoundly humbled, realizing that the woman facilitating this miracle was risking her entirely rebuilt civilian career, committing the exact same crime of breaking protocol she had been court-martialed for 12 years ago. Only now, she was doing it for him. Squeeze the pressure bag, David. Force the volume in, Sarah barked. We just need his von Willebrand factor to bridge the gap. Sterling pumped his fist rhythmically. Slowly, agonizingly, the numbers on the monitor began to climb. Her pressure hit 70/45. The chest tube output slowed as Sterling's biological cement sealed the microscopic tears in her tissue. 10 minutes later, the blood bank technician burst in with the thawed cryoprecipitate. Sarah immediately clamped the direct line and switched Chloe to the concentrated factors. Within 30 minutes, Chloe's pressure stabilized at a safe 110/70. Sarah slumped against the glass wall, exhausted. She had done it, but the relief shattered when the heavy ICU doors swung open. Dr. Harrison Boyle, the chief administrator, marched in with Captain Reynolds, a naval medical liaison. They stared in horror at the direct transfusion tubing in the biohazard bin. Dr. Jenkins, Boyle's face was apoplectic. "You violated federal medical regulations and exposed us to immense liability. You are suspended immediately. You will never practice medicine again." "Stop!" Admiral Sterling stood up. He was pale from blood loss, but his spine was pure steel. "Dr. Jenkins did exactly what I ordered her to do." Sarah stared at him. "Admiral, don't." "Quiet, Doctor," Sterling snapped, turning to Captain Reynolds. "Captain, 12 years ago, I illegally expunged my daughter's Type 3 von Willebrand diagnosis from her medical records so she could pass her physical. When she began to bleed to death tonight because of my lie, I used the threat of military force to coerce Dr. Jenkins into this transfusion. The liability is entirely mine." Reynolds looked horrified. "Sir, you are confessing to a felony." "I am well aware," Sterling said grimly. He extended his wrists. "Contact the Master-at-Arms. I am surrendering my command." 6 months later, Naval Station, Norfolk. The mahogany tribunal room smelled exactly as it had a decade ago. Richard Sterling stood in his dress whites, stripped of his ribbons and stars. The board delivered the verdict with cold efficiency. "Guilty of falsification of federal records and conduct unbecoming. You are dishonorably discharged and forfeit all pensions." The gavel fell. The devastating karma had come full circle. The man who had ruthlessly destroyed a young nurse for breaking protocol to save a life had just sacrificed his entire empire and freedom for the exact same crime. As Sterling walked out, a civilian now, he found Dr. Sarah Jenkins waiting by the marble columns, looking every bit the chief of trauma. "She's walking again," Richard told her quietly. "Because of you. I was wrong about you, Sarah. You were the only real sailor on that ship." Sarah gave a slow nod. She reached into her pocket, pressed her silver Navy Nurse Corps challenge coin into his palm, and walked away. Sterling gripped the coin tightly. He had lost his fleet and his stars. But as he went to see his daughter, he knew it was the best trade he had ever made. What a breathtaking, emotionally charged finale. The sheer power of karma in this story is absolutely undeniable. Admiral Sterling, the man who coldly destroyed Dr. Jenkins' life for breaking protocol, ultimately had to publicly sacrifice his own career, face a court-martial, and suffer the exact same dishonorable discharge to save his daughter's life and protect the doctor he once ruined. The dramatic twists, the life-or-death medical stakes, and the ultimate redemption make this an unforgettable tale of vengeance giving way to sacrifice. If this intense story of medical drama and hard-hitting karma kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. Don't forget to share this video with your friends who love a great plot twist, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible, heart-stopping storytelling. Let us know in the comments, do you think the Admiral truly redeemed himself? See you in the next video.